Namo over to everyone. This is Abhivardhan from Global Law Assembly. I'm back again, and this week we will be discussing about global approaches to realpolitik. Tomorrow, of course, about the New York Times, and tonight we are going to discuss about artificial intelligence and intellectual property law, which is something a very unique thing altogether. So I have Ankit Sani, who is a member of the AI Resilience Council in ISAIL, and he's an IB law expert. Namaste, Ankit ji. Glad to have you. And tonight, this is a very short discussion I'm going to have, like I had with Amrita last time on Dharma and Web3. So we are going to have a discussion on artificial intelligence and intellectual property law in the worlds of Web2 and Web3. Now, currently, Web3 is something which is already developed, which is the Bitcoin world, the blockchain world, but we're not going to talk about that right now. We'll start with the Web2 process because uh, a lot of things have happened in the world of economics, and intellectual property law has transformed as disruptive technologies like AI have come into the forefront. So, through this discussion, an intention is to ignite a sort of discourse into the role of disruptive technologies beyond the question of economics and all of that, because there's a very interesting case called very interesting thing called Dabus, which was given IP recognition when it comes to where it was decided by the judge that it can be an inventor but not a patentee. It is like a trusteeship relation given to a human, but it was given that. Does it have implications for companies and inventors who are going to create any kind of AI? That is something which we should discuss, because for now, the Patents Act is not compatible to deal with these areas, but the Patent Act can be, creatively interpreted in other ways. Maybe some guidelines can come, maybe some other approaches can come. So yes, this discourse is done in good faith to understand how these technicalities come forth in simple form. So to begin with, my first question to you is, Ankit ji, that how should we relate artificial intelligence into the world of copyright law, and I would say intellectual property law? If you can enlighten to the viewers in very simple way, maybe in the first 3 minutes or 5 minutes. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much, Abhivardhan. At the outset, I'll just take a quick moment to thank you and your team for having me on the show. It's obviously a pleasure to be here, and it's also a pleasure to be part of the Resilience Council with the great amount of work that you all are doing back at the association. It's absolutely cutting edge, and I'm glad to see. The association taking a pioneering step as far as developing the policy in this space, or adding different perspectives or value adds, etc., is concerned. Now, coming back to your question, you see why the question of artificial intelligence has become very relevant in today's world when we talk about intellectual property rights is because intellectual property rights being generated by artificial intelligence is a reality. It's not something that we used to see in the movies or read about in novels maybe 20 years or 15 years ago. Not from yesterday, but since some years, this is a reality. We are seeing programs that are generating or completing in their own expression of an idea that was brought about into existence by renowned musicians like Mozart, who couldn't unfortunately complete their work, and then the AI, having learned from Mozart's existing data set, being his other works and several other classical Western classical musicians and their data sets, having to reimagine how Mozart would have finished a particular work, or to imagine how, if a particular painter or artist was alive, how would he reimagine a particular scene or a view or something. Now, all of these things are today a reality. So the question of giving protection to intellectual property that gets created by AI has become more relevant than ever before. So this is what we're dealing with. But on the other hand, we all are, and when we say we all, it's not just us as Indians, but in several jurisdictions, we all have legislations, intellectual property legislations that date back to the 90s in certain cases. Even in India's case, the Copyright Act that dates back to the late 50s, 60s. So there's a lot of change that has happened in the world. Of course, everything's transformed, and therefore there's a requirement today for lawmakers, for policymakers, for leaders everywhere, to realize the new dimensions of intellectual property that are being created by artificial intelligence taking the center stage in today's world. So that, in my view, is how I would summarize or kind of contextualize the discussion and try to address your first question.
I would really appreciate that. So, you've given a very interesting overview of the times that, okay, fine, there were particular legislations that came into being and they have their own applicability and so forth. As the 2000s have passed and the euro crisis has gone, now the COVID-19 pandemic is not in the end, but it's converting into an endemic in various countries. How do you see the role of AI and its own patentability as well as its own copyright and copyright related issues globally? And what can India decipher from it, learn from it, and understand from already existing problems? So, yeah.
So, as we're all aware, we've been following the Davos journey over the past few months, and seeing how different countries, their legal systems, their judiciary, or their IP offices are reacting to this situation. Nobody realized, but it was almost time for somebody to come up and take the stride forward and bring up this issue. And of course, in this case, all credit goes to the project team back at the artificial inventor project, which comprises of Professor Ryan Abbott, Stephen Thaler, and others who've taken this. Now, you see, there are two perspectives that one needs to see. How the pandemic has played a role, I'm not very certain, but my personal understanding of the past 18 months and their relevance in this context is that things have become increasingly digital. Perhaps if this pandemic was not to come our way, the scale or the pace at which we were going digital could have been or would have ended up being much lower than what it is today. So the pandemic, in many ways, has acted as an accelerator to the digital journey, and has brought a lot of things on the digital platform across industries, and that obviously has in turn fueled growth everywhere. All kinds of technologies, not just artificial intelligence, but all kinds of technologies that have improved very rapidly, so that the changing needs or the sudden changed needs of people around the world could be catered to. So that definitely, in my view, is added, has acted as as a catalyst to this entire equation. At the same time, you see, when this question comes up, what we need to be wary or be mindful about is there are two things that we need to see when we talk about intellectual property. People get confused, and after the Davos episode and the developments that we keep reading about, as well as the time when Raghav, the artificial intelligence app that I commissioned, when that was awarded a copyright for a painting that it co-authored with me based on an input that I gave the program. You see, there's a lot of commentary that I've read since then with much interest in print media, in over webinars, and a lot of colleagues have reached out with questions and so on. Now, people are mixing the two questions together. I feel we should keep these two questions distinct. Now, what are these questions? These questions are as follows. The first question is about giving rights to AI, which I believe forms part of a bigger debate, which obviously is already underway in several forms, whether it's formulating artificial intelligence policy by various countries, including India, or it's about looking at the human rights implications of recognizing artificial intelligence, granting them citizenship. In my personal view, I think this question should be kept absolutely separate. Now, this debate, which we are here to do today, the discussion that we're doing, I think, is got very little to do with whether artificial intelligence has feelings or will feel incentivized or rewarded or should be kept at the same pedestal as a human being in terms of giving rights. I think the question today, at least as far as the intellectual property world is concerned, is there is a substantial amount of content that is getting generated through artificial intelligence programs, whether it is music or it is paintings or it is articles, novels, whatever. This is all useful innovation, creativity, content that is getting generated. So the question before us is, does this merit protection or does this not? And if it merits protection, who should be rewarded? What would be the purpose? Of course, at the outset, at this stage, I feel it would be futile if we get into the debate of whether the artificial intelligence, if it gets rewarded, how will it reap the benefits of the reward? How will someone ensure that the royalty, let's say, that's collected on account of the works that it generated, is put back or plowed back into improving that AI program? I think these are debates which can be left aside for the time being. What we should focus on is, at the moment, asking ourselves this question, whether this artificial intelligence generated content is something that should be rendered protection, or should it be publicly juris available to the public at large to copy? And if that is the case, what implications would it have to the people who are programming, coding, creating this, developing these kind of solutions that are delivering innovations at the same quality, if not better quality, than what an equally talented human being, a musician or a painter, would do, right? So, and what implications, what impact would it have on the person? Would the person that is creating such solutions, would he or she get disincentivized? Would they feel demotivated and not want to create another program that writes music autonomously or paints autonomously or assistively with human input, right? Would it make sense if we don't recognize this? At the same time, would it make sense? Now, this interestingly is the other relevant issue which I had the privilege of submitting when I was invited to the Parliamentary Standing Committee in December in 2020. This was the other interesting aspect that I was asked to speak about, and some of which has made its way into the report as well. The question was, how do you link these two things? Would it make sense if I, as a person who has zero talent in a particular field, let's say if I have zero talent as a painter, if I was to use an artificial intelligence program, give it some of my own input, let the AI use its own innate abilities, capabilities, and create something of value. And then, because the provisions in today's copyright law don't allow for an AI to be given recognition as an author, should I be identified as the owner and the author of that painting and take credit for that and reap benefits of assigning that, selling it potentially to a third party, or licensing it out and getting that? How would that play out if another person who paints painting with a paintbrush, or is a very talented graphics designer, uses a very popular graphics solution, program, software to create graphics with his or her own talent? If you were to do a due diligence on my creations and on that person's creations, legally, when you look at the certificates that the copyright registry issues under the present framework of copyright law, there would be absolutely no difference between what my certificate will say and what that other person's certificate will say, which means to a third person, I can easily pass off the idea that I was talented enough to have created that on my own, because the present legal framework does not require me to disclose that I had actually generated that with the help of an AI program whose capabilities were substantively used rather than my own in creating a work. which would seemingly be disadvantageous to the person who spends, let's say, 10 hours or more in creating a design of the same quality, and probably n number of years that that person has spent in getting trained in creating that level of art or music or whatever they create, right? So it's to bring an answer to these questions, whether a human who uses the assistance of an AI program and creates something, whether that creation could be or should be kept at the same pedestal as the creation by a person who's skilled to do that. My recommendation or my suggestion to the Parliamentary Standing Committee was very simple. I said, when the law was amended, when we brought in the concept of cinematograph films and sound recordings, and they became mainstream much earlier, of course, but we made amendments to our law much later. There was a reduced period of protection. There is a reduced period of protection that is given to photographs, that is given to cinematograph films or sound recordings. Why? Because these are considered to be secondary works which are comprised of the primary literary, dramatic, musical, artistic works. A picture taken with with the assistance of a camera is not equal to an artistic copyright, because the camera has a substantive role to play in adding to the quality of the picture that's created. So the question is, should AI generated works not get recognition, and while getting recognition, should they not be placed at a different pedestal, perhaps a lower pedestal, in terms of giving lower protection or lesser number of years than what you would do to a painting or a piece of music, etc., that has been created by a human creator? So that, I believe, is what we should be asking, or lawmakers or the courts should be asking today in terms of the question, rather than getting into the debates of whether an AI program should be given citizenship or should function with X amount of autonomy to be able to place at the same level as a human, and so on and so forth. I think that's futile. So I don't know if this addresses your question appropriately, but we can keep the conversation going, and I'm happy to pass it back to you and hear more views from you.
I really appreciate that. So, to add up to this, I had a discussion with a professor from King's College London, Dr. Roger Bronsford, and he talks about Law 3.0. So, viewers, you can watch the last episode, the last episode I had in September or August. I don't remember that right now. In September, I had with Dr. Roger Bronsford. I had discussed his book, The Law 3.0, about law students, and it was not about law students, but it was about technology law, as different stages of technology governance will come in, because technology is usually associated with the domain of constitution and administrative law in most countries. That's the whole concept. Or it can be a European Union model, which is product liability issues, and there's an EU civil liability law as well. And based on that, I think there are reports by the European Parliament. So question is quite simple. So in this discussion which I had with him, what I discovered was that you can go to any n number of levels in a much exploitative sense when it comes to legal interpretations of such things. And I agree with you, we should not get on the questions of AI being human alike or AI being animal alike or all those, because I remember there's a center in Harvard University which works on non-human rights. So I mean, animal rights was okay, bird rights was okay. This one practically might or might not make sense. So, if we see it from a perspective of creativity, since we raised the question of creativity, I think, um, as far as digital content is concerned, because that is the main question. I mean, robotics, we are not going to see anything right now, or we are not expecting anything big. I mean, we see some samples in MIT, but they are again based on Americans. I would be very happy when they do Kathak or Kalariyapattu through robots. That would be the challenge to do, or do some Chinese or Japanese dance. It would be really difficult to. So, I mean, we are not at the level of robotics right now. And again, utility questions, how we'll use them. So let's get on digital content right away, not robotics. uh, what I generally see is, I think, when it comes to question of creativity, people usually will have issues of two kinds. which are central around economic weights, because economics is something which has an argument which is taken that, you know what, somebody is getting some economic benefits. Should I not sue the person, or should I not extract some particular financial benefits? As far as the courts are concerned, as far as the legal authorities are concerned, there might be certain methods of dispute resolution, which is a different thing altogether. I'm not a person in arbitration, so I'm not going to comment on it, but there are methods. So if we see that digital content is a very interesting disruptive role to play, what is going to happen is that human creativity can be very much considered wholesale in that sense, and that is where the point comes in, that salience for human beings does not exist, because we have to understand that neoliberalism is in a backlash. What does it mean is that the economic configurations are actually in a different problem, and all these companies from the big tech and other aspects, they are actually not going to reap much benefits without a large economic impact, which is increase of per capita income and all of that. The Indo-Pacific is the future. You can't extract a lot from Europe because it's not going to work. America, corporate America is out of control. It's not going to. China, restricted access, you can't do with the Chinese. Taiwan is a small country. Russia will not let you do it. So you have Africa, Asia, which is the Indo-Pacific particularly. So if we, because Indo-Pacific is an emerging region, um, how should we see the role of indigeneity here? Because if there are indigenous people, maybe developers or MSMEs or content creators in India and the Indo-Pacific region, because that's the focus for Europe and the US right now, uh, how should they pose a copyright law arrangement when it comes to these kind of disruptive tech? I think it's possible for other kinds also. The reason I point out AI always is that AI is something which is very which has its own dynamic features, and it can even transform into other technologies based on the technology's competence and the technology's features. And that's why most of the time it's machine learning based, and it's not AI in general. Things are automation, but it's not necessary. But in digital content, that kind of machine learning program is there. So how do you see it for emerging economies like us? Because we have an economic problem as well, then again enforcement and so forth. How do you see in that sense?
Great points, Abhivardhan. And I think this opens up a whole larger debate about, again, this debate at some level, as I'm trying to digest what you said and think about it, has a lot to do, again, at a granular level with how we perceive others' rights, how they perceive our rights, and to what extent will we promise to enforce or defend these rights mutually, right? And bringing this in the context of what you said, both geopolitical as well as where the technology is reached, we are at a junction where we're talking about metaverses being the future. In some years, maybe not years, in some months, we might be sitting across the world as we are today, but at the moment everything is two-dimensional. I'm viewing this, and others are probably viewing this on a two-dimensional screen. It's flat, but there'd be a time very soon when we'd be doing business meetings, fireside chats, discussions, debates, webinars like these, in a three-dimensional world, which will be more lifelike than what we've ever had before. Now this obviously complicates issues, uh, to a very large extent, because once you get out of the square that we are currently being broadcast in, and it becomes a three-dimensional world, I look around everywhere, there is something for me to see. There would be someone speaking something that I speak, or I do, would have a consequent action, reaction, impact on someone else. So when we're moving at, in terms of technology, to a level where the entire world, despite all the decentralization happening, ironically, the entire world at some level is connecting and becoming more and more centralized. We're talking about a situation where, back in the 40s, in the 50s, when today's international bodies, organs like the United Nations and other important international organs were set up, the underlining flavor in that era was human rights and its exploitation. I feel in our age and going forward, the underlying issue will be privacy, data protection, integrity. Again, because there'll be so much of content, so it'll be intellectual property protection and enforcement of intellectual property, and disparagement and defamation, etc. in the digital world. So we're actually talking about a situation where we would need to set up a parallel body or a parallel world, as we did when the need was to have an international body for all the major jurisdictions, the countries of the world, to get together on a single platform to begin with, talking about respecting human rights, and have an international code of justice where matters would be heard and whose decisions would be followed, not because the constitution of a particular country, which is sovereign by itself, binds it to be bound by the decision or judgment of such an international court, but by choice that country contracted itself into an international obligation with several other countries who also contracted themselves to agree to be bound by a system. So I feel, in terms of rights in the digital space, rights pertaining to content, and rights in metaverses and all kinds of worlds that are going to exist in the not so far future, we should be looking at setting up a parallel body, or maybe repurposing the existing bodies and frameworks that we have, to create a core, to create an enforcement mechanism that will be anchored on international cooperation. Just as human rights has been, and economic and cultural rights or social rights has been, this is the need of the hour today. Today, especially because of the pandemic, I'm probably spending more time at home. So I'm not facing a human rights crisis, or I'm not facing a discrimination because I belong to a minority. Whatever I'm facing is over the internet, or is over the virtual world, in which I connect with all of my other people in different capacities, whether it's my family, or it's my colleagues, or it's other people from across the globe. So what happens on that media is what needs to be regulated. And there's in my view, there's once, all of us globally have come together and done this before, and successfully to a large extent, there is no reason why countries cannot come together again and try to set up a body that would respect the enforcement of rights on the digital platform and digital media.
That's interesting. I think when it comes to multilateral institutions, the efficacy of the multilateral institutions is at stake. And in the Indo-Pacific, what's going to happen is that when I say people, I mean countries, countries will generally go for multilateral approaches like the Quad or something, because within them you can have better enforcement mechanisms. You can have regional not agreements, I would say, regional considerations of acceptance on issues where you can finalize that, okay, these are certain standards to channelize, and yes, we can agree on them on economic or other aspects. I think environmental impact and other things can come in. So to wrap this up in a much interesting way. Uh, my question is about the role of Web3 in a comparative and a much pragmatic sense as to their impact. Now, Web 2 is what we're talking about right now. Web 3 is blockchain, etc. You talked about virtual reality, and we know Facebook to Meta conversion, which has its own uh, uh, contentious realities, as we know why. Um, Ironically, uh, if you see the role of decentralization of currencies in that way, and decentralizations of ecosystems, revenue systems will change. The way content creators get their things done will change, because NFT is also on a rise. It's not just that anything which is made by Beethoven or Mozart is now on NFT. Anything can be on NFT. So even its value is something which is changing. There's no set standard there. Like anything which is made like a zigzag art can be sold at I don't know what. $1 million US, but something like Beethoven's orchestra, or maybe something from India, maybe some particular music, Carnatic music, or some painting of 17th century by a painter in Rajasthan, it could be sold at $20,000. So there is no set rates, there is no there's those a regulator is a different issue, that's a state policy, executive policy. But I think at a private level we don't see that happening right now. It's just fine, people are having a community, they're using NFTs and they're buying things. It happens for domains also. Like you can people can buy their own domains.nft. They can just choose any name they wish to, nickname or anonymous name or whatsoever. And pseudonymization is in the rise. The pseudonymous economy is happening. So people are getting pseudonymous. They are not anonymous, but they're pseudonymous. They're changing names, they're changing identity. It's actually impacting. How do you see? Of course, this transition will take years. I'll say decades. I'll say decades because it's not going to be fast. Sovereign countries will not accept it initially, or they will come up with their own currency. I think if I'm right, RBI might come up with its own cryptocurrency instead of saying, fine, you know what, invest in Ethereum, Bitcoin, and others. So to conclude on that, what do you think? The role of Web3. Yeah.
So with Web3, what I feel is we've, like you pointed out, we've already started the transition. And see, the challenge with and the journey with Web 1 to Web 2, Web 2 to Web 3 is always that we're getting more immersed in the virtual environment with the new technologies coming in. And it's not just about the sensory impact of things, it's not about having to visit websites in virtual or augmented reality. It's also that more and more, as we see things that were in front of us, things that were tangible, are also coming in the digital space as intangibles through a counterpart. But what I believe is missing, or is sort of in the gray, is the chained link that links the digital from what is there in the physical world. And it's that gap that we have to bridge. For instance, when you speak of NFTs, the number one debate, despite their rising popularity, etc., and with more and more people jumping onto the bandwagon, delivering their creative content on the digital platform by dropping NFTs. And of course, it's also at the moment is very lucrative because people are paying much more money, even if it's the novelty factor. But people are still paying much more money than they would pay for the same piece of art or music, in tangible or offline form, right? But what is missing is really the bridge that determines the relationship between what is there in an NFT versus what is there in the actual painting, right? So what rights am I giving in an NFT? That appears to be the backbone of contention at the moment. Am I giving a license? Am I giving a limited exclusive license which is numbered, and limited to the number of NFTs that a particular creative has? Or am I assigning any rights? Am I parting with something? If I intend to part with something, let's say, even if I want to part with something, what happens to the actual physical object or article for which I create an NFT? How do I transfer the possession of that? And what provision of law will determine if somebody owns the NFT, which I transfer to that person's wallet against valuable consideration that I receive in my bank account or my wallet? What law is there to say that that would be deemed to be constructive possession transferred, although the actual physical product with which it is linked remains in my physical possession? And what provision is there to say that I would then, in that case, may perhaps be holding that physical object in trust, the possession of that physical object in trust for the person to whom I transferred the token, right? So all these things require a lot of changes in law. And before law, I think in policy, we must have a policy for Web3, or digital world, or whatever we wish to call it, which, again, coming back to where I started from, is no longer just limited to things or ideas on paper. It has started to happen, and we're starting to slowly see the transition happening from Web 2 to Web3. And like you pointed out, it's a very long journey, but at the same time, it's noticeable. We notice the change when we moved from Web 1 to Web 2. And when we're moving from Web 2 to Web 3, we can see the changes and the differences already, the challenges coming up. So to fill the void, I think there is an imminent need for the leaders, different stakeholders to get together and formulate a policy in this, translate that into tangent, cogent provisions of law amendments, etc., or bring a new law to answer some of these questions and regulate some of these aspects of what seems to be everyday life now and going forward.
Indeed. To conclude this, I have something to share from Twitter, which is really interesting. So let me do that right away. In case people do not understand non fungible tokens, this is what it is. If something which is a non fungible token, this is non fungible token. It's like a painting. If it's a fungible token, it is like your Dogecoin. If it is your fungible and non-token, it can be something like an artifact or something like a degree in computer science. And if it is something non-fungible, non-token, it is something like a living being like a cat or something. Now, let me share the second one, which is a thread by Balaji Srinivasan, who I very much admire for his works in crypto. So, okay, I think I've shared the same one. So just 1 minute. Okay. Yeah, I think it's visible. So, ironically, what we see here is that what Balaji says is that after NFTs, we'll have NTFs, non-transferable but fungible. For example, a college degree in computer science, better example, an on-chain crypto credential earned for solving a single exercise, non-transferable because can't be sold, fungible because all did the same exercise. One way to implement might be ERC1155, a multi-token standard. Imagine a vector of booleans where each element is 0/1 if you did or did not possess a crypto credential. So this might seem very technical for people, but a much simple idea was that NFT and crypto are also something which we should take into consideration in future. So I think with this short session, we will conclude now. I would like to thank the viewers too for viewing for watching this. And tomorrow I'm going to discuss at 7 p.m. with Ashley Rinsberg from Israel about on his new book, The Grey Lady Winged, which is on how international media publications like the New York Times look at the globe, how they approach international affairs, how they approach the Cold War, how they approached other considerations, the Second World War, and even the current times, the Syrian crisis or the COVID-19 pandemic. This is going to be a very interesting discussion considering the role of media in international affairs, which is very less discussed often. And post then, yes, we will be coming up with more episodes of Indus Think, Global Hint, or AI Now. Till then, thank you so much. Sayonara, and see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. again. Thank you.